One of them is this organization. So this is a huge US-based retailer, and they have a hugely growing e-commerce footprint, right? So they acquired about 10 e-commerce companies recently to be able to compete with Amazon. And well, we've been working with them, and it has been an absolute pleasure. And this is one of the main motivations for them to move towards a more agile operating structure within HR, saying, hey, we want our core competence to be the delivery of people products. Now, people products might sound a bit weird because, what would that really be about? And to me, it is about introducing this product mindset, which has been very prevalent in the tech space for a long time, and introducing it to all the valuable products that you service your employees with. So those can, of course, be new systems and processes, but they can also be simply a new approach to help certain groups of employees. So thinking of the HR organization as more of a product-minded organization is a big change there. And what we see in product-oriented organizations is that they have these teams ready to create and service those products, including HR technology products. Now, what did we do at this company? First of all, a good diagnosis, of course, of the way they were operating. Then we simply advised them to pick either one of these three options. And you will probably guess which one I like most. The first one is about having this full-time product team, which basically has the idea there that you still have your traditional reporting lines with their VPs, but there is a separate product team that is there to accelerate the delivery of people products. And they do this based on a prioritized list of action items called the product backlog. And the product team is full-time and stable. So that is one option, and it kind of separates it from the traditional hierarchy. The other option, which I would say is closest to what we see in a lot of HR organizations, is to have these part-time product teams set up. Which are basically a mixture of people that come from traditional HR silos, which are then being led by what we call in the Agile world product owners. The difficulty here, of course, is that you are in this matrix type situation in which everybody starts pulling at the same people from different sides, both from the hierarchy and from the product team side. Now, this one, I must say, is beautiful, because here you actually see dedicated product teams focused on a certain part of the employee journey. So here we see 4 product teams based on 4 journey phases: join, grow, the day-to-day work, and next steps. And that means that whatever is prevalent in that journey phase, right? So in join, of course, it might be people joining the company and the recruitment processes. It might be that you're introducing new HR technology there. It might also be that you're helping people out in a very practical way, which are running into impediments. So any type of question, whether it be operational or more strategic, gets handled by that product team. So this is the actual route, of course, that we departed on, because in the longer term, this is the most powerful, I would say, at least within a larger HR organization. Smaller HR organizations can use the same principles, it just has to be configured a bit different. So that is an example. This is an example of a big telco company we work with, and the interesting thing they did there is to say, hey, these parts of the journey should be led by somebody called the journey lead, and that means that there's no more classical hierarchical position for leading these product teams, but there's basically a journey lead which then manages his or her environment to make sure that that journey experience is the most optimal for the employee. And to make it even more practical, this is an example of how these teams are then accepting work. So here you see, chunks of work, which are here arranged according to quarters, which the teams can work on. And this telco organization, as you see, has 4 rows of those teams that are working on a certain journey phase. And there's a 5th team, which is the overall team, because there will always be certain processes and issues that are kind of overlapping or that cut across the journey phases. ING Bank in the Netherlands is a famous bank for adopting this agile way of working. And they actually have a team of, if I remember this correctly, 12 employee journey advisors, which are continuously working on that employee journey to make sure that the whole of the journey is optimized. Really, again, to prevent this pitfall of sub-optimizing for certain parts of the journey. And here you can see how that actually boils down in IMG structure. There's a bunch of articles as well on this online, in which certain parts of the journey have dedicated teams to help them. Well, that's the most important part of my story. I guess I'll switch it over back to you guys.
Thanks, Gideon. I think we probably have lots of questions. But I'm curious to know, in terms of the journey lead, right, that you shared with us earlier, does the journey lead need to be someone who has had formal leadership experience? What's required typically? What in your mind would be the right kind of journey lead in terms of the profile?
Yeah. Well, I think, referring back to your question about agile leadership, I think a lot of those competencies around protecting teams, setting a compelling vision, etc., are still very important for that journey lead role. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a hierarchical role or a role that should fit into somebody's profile who has been in such a position. It should be actually somebody who's very passionate about serving people within that journey phase. And what you often see is that the journey lead doesn't work on that role dedicated. So they might be inside a product team while being a journey lead at the same time. So it's kind of a split role.
Interesting that you actually brought out the point about passion. And that's a big part of what Agile is about, right? It encourages people to pursue their work with passion, because there are right conditions, like we say, make people awesome, create value incrementally, and I think the other piece is psychological safety. And I think some of these points are actually related to some of the questions that have actually come up in the Q&A box where I took a quick look. We are going to actually take on questions now because I've noticed we have quite a number of questions from some of you, which is great. So I think I've asked Gideon a number of questions that I felt were burning questions. So I think we should address the Q&A questions now.
Definitely.
Before we start on that, I will just mention that the session we have planned today is for 1 hour. So we intend to pause the Q&A when it reaches the end of the session. And then those who wish to stay on, we can extend up to 30 minutes for the rest of the questions. So we can start now on the questions. You can continue to put in more questions. Over to you, Evelyn.
Great, thank you. So we are looking at the questions that you have, some observations. Yeah, indeed, IDP to IDD, I agree. So positive, right? Question here is, what do you think are the adjustments needed for Agile HR leadership in work from home times? I think that's a very good one for all of us to consider. And I'll have a go at this, Gideon.
Yeah.
Please jump in. I think if we go back to the modern Agile principles, if we go with those 4 principles, I think it would make the work from home period equally enjoyable and fruitful for the team and even for leaders. The reason why we said that is because we've heard stories of, of how leaders have been very concerned about the output of their team members because they can't actually physically see them at their workplace and know that they are working. So I think one thing about making people awesome is actually having trust, right, in your people. And of course, the other principle that is not as overt in Agile HR is actually the concept of being accountable for results. So Agile HR absolutely advocates outcomes and results. So if there are processes that you are using today to allow teams to actually work together within teams and with their respective leaders, and where you can actually see progress, you know, and when people are discussing, and when the team actually updates, or when they check in with the leaders, they can actually see the progress. And that's an opportunity, again, to recognize that people are actually taking responsibility and being accountable. And that's an opportunity to recognize awesome results if they're awesome. And so I think that Agile HR does actually provide opportunities for that. Again, the psychological safety piece is very important, the trust element piece, the coaching piece, they all come in. Gideon, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that is explained very well, definitely.
There's a question here, Zopa candidate room. While they are doing assessment, how do we know that they are doing it without any assistance? There is an option for a particular feature to be turned on where it can actually monitor that. So there is the possibility to actually remove that risk, and we'll be happy to share more about that. So that can be mitigated, to your question.
Yeah, and there's a very interesting one here by Andy Schmidt, who asks, what's your view on cross-functional agile teams beyond HR? For example, HR and business units to help create innovations based on real-time information. Wouldn't that help to break down silos? Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree with that. I would say that the most radical agile thinkers would say that there's no future for the HR department. I'm not sure if that is completely correct. I mean, having a group of people with a common knowledge field there, I think, is still very valuable. However, yes, for example, this telco example I showed you, the cross-functional team that they set up there included data and tech people, as well as people from the security and facility space. So that was a stable cross-functional team there that included the business. And what I also often see is for suppliers and partners to be integrated into those teams. So yeah, there's a lot of options there to go beyond HR.
That's an interesting one on culture. Does Agile HR work well in any culture, either business or country, geography? In other words, do you see cultural differences? That's a very interesting one. I feel, based on our observations and our research and what we have experienced, there are cultural differences, and that's because in some of the traditional organizations, it's very difficult to break out of that hierarchy or the bureaucracy of organizations, and leaders sometimes struggle with having that shift of their mindset, and in the traditional organization, the command and control aspects are very, very prevalent. Whereas in an agile organization, title is not important anymore. However, it's not to say that the experience and expertise of the leader is not going to be important. But it does mean that in many instances, people work together as teams, which I feel can be quite confronting for certain cultures. So I would say that there are, but we have also seen organizations with very strong leaders who have been able to start moving in that direction. But it is actually, like we said, whether you are an organization in the West or East, we spoke about this, going agile is actually a commitment.
All right, thank you. We'll now take a short pause to wrap up our session. For those who would like to stay on, we'll resume the Q&A shortly. DecodeHR is running a contest for this webinar. We really like to hear your views on how HR in your organization has become more agile during this pandemic. So you'll see the QR code coming up. You can scan that and then you can let us know your answers, and there are prizes to be won. Share with us your ideas. And we really appreciate if you could give us feedback for this session so that we can improve it for future events. You can scan the QR code or use the link. Organize Agile is also offering a promo code for its e-learning course and introduction to Agile HR. So you'll see that coming up as well shortly.
Yeah, and this is the state of Agile HR, very highly recommended.
Yeah.
Yeah, come pay us a visit, either in the Netherlands or New York.
So please fill up the feedback for us. Really appreciate that. So thank you to those who have already submitted the feedback, and please continue to fill in the feedback. We'll leave that running. So for those who have to go now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
And we hope to see you at the next webinar. And for all those who would like to stay on, please hold on, and we will soon start again our Q&A session. Let us just go through the slides one more time for those who missed it. Please scan the QR code.
So while that's running, I just take some of the questions very quickly. I think there's a question on the Panelite data. How is attrition data actually captured and used to provide the insights on predicting attrition? We can share that with you after the session. There is actually a very powerful system that with very, very good features. We'll be able to share the details with you after the session. We've got your contact details. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just typing the answer here to a question of Jessica Lau, who's about, does Agile mean having less people to be able to do more work, in fact? And I would say, no, Agile is not about reducing your workforce. As a principle, it is mostly about empowering teams. So those highly autonomous teams are the engine of innovation, are able to weather crises and respond to change. And of course, yeah, the number of teams you have and the growth you can realize as an organization will determine the number of people you have inside. And there have been some cases of restructuring organizations to become more agile, in which some people that did not have certain competencies had to leave the organization. So yeah, we have seen that. So that is a reduction, but it's mostly a reduction because of certain collaborative competencies lacking, instead of just a reduction because you're more efficient. I would say that Agile is not so much about efficiency; it is about effectiveness, doing the right things. But I see another question coming from.
Yeah, maybe you can answer it. So.
Yeah. Yeah, which is basically about how can we educate students in this world of Agile HR, etc. I think a movement that is worth mentioning in the education world is this thing called EduScrum, which is basically implementing a part of Agile within classes, and those can be in secondary schools, primary schools, but also in the college and university system. I have actually been lecturing at HR studies in the Netherlands as well as abroad. And yeah, the fun thing is that students grab these concepts pretty easily because for them it's very intuitive. It's just for us old people that it's sometimes a bit harder to actually understand.
Right, there's a question here on what skills and competencies do HR professionals need to be agile and to be part of an agile HR team? Well, I'm not sure where you're starting off from in terms of your baseline, but I would say attending this webinar is a great start. But there is a lot of good materials out there, and of course there's learning that you can attend from good organizations, and I know Gideon has just offered that as well, an online learning. But in terms of competencies, I would say the ability to actually work with ambiguity for a start. Because Agile principles do not actually dictate frameworks. And I think for HR practitioners, sometimes we struggle with that because we want a very prescribed approach to do certain things. And I think traditionally, the HR function has been very, very prescriptive, right? We know how we approach benchmarking. We know how we approach competency-based learning. So it has always been very prescribed. So adopting HR approach requires one to actually unlearn and relearn. So unlearn some of the traditional concepts and the need for structure upfront, because you may not always get the sort of structure that you're used to. So I would say in terms of competencies, it's really that curiosity, the ability to actually to grasp concepts that are not as direct. So do you want to add to that, Gideon?
No, I think that's a great answer, Evelyn.
Thank you. So yeah, and I would say an inquisitive mind, is very important because Agile HR would look different in every organization. So appreciating the nuances that is so important to be able to develop something that is unique to your organization. Yeah, and the ability to really collaborate is critical, I would say. Critical thinking, the ability to collaborate is huge. Communication skills, I would say, are very important as well.
Well, there's a couple of questions about this whole journey concept. So Lintio is asking, can you explain the integration of development and operations under an Agile HR structure? Yeah, so this is a very interesting concept. It basically means that those that are developing the solutions, which can be HR tech solutions or other solutions, are actually responsible for servicing a part of it as well. So it doesn't mean that they will become a permanent service team. At some point, it might be actually migrated to a more service-oriented team. But it does mean that in principle, those teams that develop those solutions also have a important responsibility in maintaining them. And that is something that is pretty new. There's not a lot of, let's say, people in the development space that have experience with that or have the ambition in that direction. So that kind of takes quite a shift for those teams to be able to grasp and embrace. The other question from Lisa was, how do you overlay these multiple business units you have within an organization with different journey needs, right? So does it necessitate you to have multiple journey teams? So, basically, who is the partner of these journey teams? And another question I often see raised in the Agile HR community is, what is the role of the HRBP, right? The business partner these days? Which I think in an Agile HR environment is also rapidly evolving. So one of the first questions there is, what does the structure on the business side look like? So organizations that have a more Agile operating structure within their business also, by that fact, are different counterparts to HR. So for example, if you're organized in what we call Agile tribes, you will have your tribe leads coming up with questions towards HR, or it might be individual teams. And I think one of the most important things is to have a very explicit agreement on what the roles of these teams are to do HR tasks themselves and which ones are there for HR to help out with. And I think, you know, the best approach is to have HR embrace a more strategic approach, which means less direct servicing of these teams and more autonomy for them. But it needs to be very explicit, that agreement. Yep. So those were a couple of mine. Any more you see in the list, Evelyn?
Yes, quite a number. There is one around, do you see that Agile promotes a more flexible workforce?
That is from a Dutch guy. Anyway.
Yes. When you say flexible, are you, I'm wondering if you're referring to a workforce that is made up of core workforce, as in permanent full-time, with a contingent workforce augmenting the entire workforce, or is your point around, you know, a workforce that is actually more agile? That means they are able to move, you know, from perhaps one function to the other, and a lot more adaptable, adapt. I would say ADEPT, adapt, in terms of taking on different roles and rising up to different challenges, particularly since, you know, organizations these days really need to pivot very quickly in view of disruption and rapid changes. I'm not sure if this participant is still on the call. Okay, core workforce with a flexible shell. Yes, so that was the point that you were making. Actually, we do see that trend. Even before this entire pandemic, many organizations have started moving in that direction, where they have a core workforce augmented with expertise from deeper specialists, or workers who prefer to be gig workers. So there is that trend from, I think, some years back. And I think with Agile HR practices, you are looking at competencies all the time, right? Because you need to think about, if I'm going to form these teams to deliver these products, do I have the right expertise? Do I have the right people for these teams? So that question of knowledge, skills, and ability will come up a lot more rapidly, which means if there are gaps, they would show up very quickly. That's because of that visibility that you have across the organization, which is what we were talking about, you know, that classification, that taxonomy. So definitely, I would see that happening, to address your question. And it also means that the organization would be able to achieve its strategic goals that much quicker and more effectively, because they know exactly what I need, when I need it, and when I need to plug my gaps. Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
So I see a great question from Turkey here. I'm just assuming that because it's a Turkish sounding name. So a question from Edis, who is saying, hey, this implementation of Agile processes, how do you do that while you're still running your day-to-day processes, right? So basically, how do you implement Agile? Because as he is saying, it's like changing the system on a plane that is already in flight. I think that's a great metaphor. And yeah, of course, this is the dilemma. Now, there's a couple of approaches there. And I would say one approach, which we often use, is to introduce this thing called an Agile portfolio, which means at the highest level in HR, and sometimes even beyond HR, starts building a portfolio of activities that it wants to work on in the coming period. And the portfolio is very visual. Now that we're all remote working, there's a couple of interesting apps to build that portfolio. And that is just a place to start and to have a good idea of, you know, what is all the stuff that we're actually working on. And you would be surprised about how much things HR organizations are working on without even knowing it. So there's a lot of people running around with certain hobbies, so to say, and kind of making that more transparent and prioritizing better, I think is really step one. So that is something I would advise, to start building that Agile portfolio. The second thing I would say is to start with one team, right? So you don't need to immediately change the structure radically. But if you work with one multidisciplinary Agile team and really give them the space and the protection by leadership to perform and to do what is right with a clear mission, I think that is something that's very powerful. And what you often see is that the experiences that arise from that team and the enthusiasm then start spreading throughout the organization. So I hope, Elise, I helped you with that question.
It's an interesting one. Which one are you going to answer, Gideon?
Sorry?
It's an interesting one about Agile HR being like a blended adoption of human-centered design thinking, UX, docs, innovation mindset, and change capability lead.
Yeah, that one is from Arian Lee.
Yeah, any comments on that?
Well, I think a lot of the concepts you mentioned there, like human-centered design, of course, is a branch of design thinking. UX, which I would say in the Agile space is EX, right? Employee experience. So that's very close to each other as well. And innovation, which is basically where the whole world of Agile started. So I would say, yes, a lot of the philosophies you mentioned are philosophies that have arisen from the digital world and which now need to be translated to the world of HR. I think one of the big pitfalls is to just use Agile or design thinking or other types of ways of working at face value without considering, what needs to be adapted to make it work for HR. So yes, these principles are very valid, and I think that the adaptation is actually the key there. Another question by Gidion Joe, who asks, don't you think that the value flow and projects are both important? And I do realize that with my presentation, saying, maybe this is the end of projects. It might have sounded as if there's no more space for projects, and I would say there still is. However, it's a different type of project. So I would say that a lot of the tools that you use in traditional project management or in project management in general are still applicable. It's just a different context in which you apply them. And the context is in optimizing that journey. So project management as a toolbox definitely is still useful, but it is integrated into the flow value. So the flow value is primary and managing projects becomes secondary. So it's still a combination in that sense. So 5 more to go. I'm sure we can do this in 10 minutes.
Have you answered the question on what are your opinions on the companies going fully remote? More specifically, how will companies be prepared for that? Just want to check if you have taken that. I think that came in.
I haven't picked that one up. Is it one you want to answer, Evelyn?
Sure. Try my best here. Seems like this is a recurring theme, right? I guess with going remote. Actually, I feel that organizations that are preparing to go agile would have a much easier time going remote, because one of the very key elements of agile teams is actually self-managing teams. And when you have teams that are self-managing, it's okay to go remote, unless you're talking about organizations that need access to equipment and so on. But with self-managing teams, these teams basically take responsibility for the outcome. They discuss and they know exactly what they need to do by when. And so you're talking about very close collaboration that is required at the outset. So that actually really helps remote teams, because you're making sure that people are not working in silo, because the process is actually setting them up for really intimate collaboration and communication. So that's my view on that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what Trevor was saying about product team members being HR team members only, or people from non-HR departments, my answer again is yes, please involve those from without. And also at the portfolio level, right? So if you have an Agile portfolio running an Agile HR, it's great to pull in the business to kind of take a fresh look at your portfolio and to decide, are we really doing the right things? Yeah, so here's a question by Arian, who's sending us a lot of questions today. It's very good, Arian, thank you. So your question here is the accountability to develop the right organizational capabilities a challenge in an Agile HR practice? As shared risk does not infer shared ownership of outcome. Yeah, so pretty complex question, I would say. But yeah, very valid in the sense that, you know, if we're building these speedboats, so to say, and those are the little startups in your organization, are they an actual owner of that part of the business? And I would say, no, they aren't, right? So in that sense, they might run certain risks, which they might not always feel the consequences of. Which is why this is one of the challenges in the world of what we call skilled agile. And skilled agile is all about making sure that the big amount of teams you have, and sometimes organizations have hundreds of agile teams running in parallel, enabling those teams to accept the right risk profiles, but also to de-risk in a lot of instances is a challenge there. And it's especially something for leadership to inspire on, for agile coaches to inspire on and say, you know, how can you reduce risk by slicing up your work in smaller pieces so that teams will not behave recklessly? I hope that answered your question, Ariane. Yeah, another question from 80s, who's hanging on from Turkey. Maybe that one is interesting for you, Evelyn. What are the characteristics of the companies that may have more difficulty in digital transformation?
I think companies that have a lot of red tape. With that, I mean highly bureaucratic companies may find it very challenging because some leaders may view it as giving up their control of the organization instead of viewing it as being able to get more strategic and to be more innovative, you know, in a shorter period of time. So companies that are very entrenched in such thinking would need more time, because at the end of the day, even though Agile is about, you know, the teams on the ground being able to do a lot of the innovating, co-creating, and tackling, you know, tough problems, you actually still need your senior leadership to really support and really coach teams and to give them that autonomy. So I would say it's not impossible though, because we have seen some very traditional organizations, you know, being able to gradually transition to a more agile thinking, more agile structure, which is why we actually made it very clear upfront that it's a real commitment. There are organizations that have not succeeded and have taken time, but the benefits are also very clear. So research has also shown that organizations that take the first step of being agile do actually see benefits pretty quickly. But in terms of making sure that it's a pervasive way of thinking, you know, and really inculcating that DNA, it takes longer time for some organizations. You know, unlike Netflix, you know, Spotify, Tesla, you know, they are what you call agile natives. That's always been the way they think and act.
Yeah. Yeah. Spotify in that sense is a very interesting story. You know, they're very adamant that, you know, their agile way of working is still evolving, right? So even though it is in their genes, they're very consciously evolving their approach as they go along. Now there's a question from Sam saying, you know, organizing HR as a product team is an interesting concept. Also aligning that to other parts of the organization that are adopting agile practices. And I guess that's not so much a question as a comment, and I think it's a very valid comment because it is all about alignment. And the big question for HR here is, are we at the forefront of this agile movement, or are we a follower? And you know, I see some HR organizations taking a very proactive role, being at the forefront, advising management, being a partner of those teams that are turning agile. And I see some HR departments which are simply surprised by it and are really grappling with it. So what our State of Agile HR report has shown is that one of the challenges for HR departments there is, how do we make sure that we understand the agile mindset and the agile concepts before we can be a good partner for the rest of the business. So, you know, starting yourself, doing it yourself, I think is essential here. So thank you, Sam, for that very good comment.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it, right? You need to start with yourself first as an individual.
Exactly.
Before you can actually start advocating or trying to suggest new ways of approaching work. And that's a big part of it, transforming self. And I think that's a big part that leaders need to think about. What does it mean if, you know, I want to be agile as a leader? What does it mean? So I think that's a conversation for another day. That's a topic in itself, right? Agile leadership. I don't think we have any more questions.
Yeah.
I think we're done with the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Gideon and Evelyn, for this enriching webinar, and thank you all attendees for staying with us patiently till the very end. And maybe we'll enlarge the slides now, because I think the smaller version was a bit difficult to scan.
And if any of you have questions, I think you have our email addresses. If anything pops up, feel free to drop us an email. We'll be happy to take on some of the questions that you may have. Just am super glad that, you know, so many people are actually keen on actually going on this Agile HR journey. That's very, very good to know.
Yeah, it's great. Can you believe it's still 30 participants at this hour? I mean, we can
All right, stay in touch. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.